I've been talking here on the show about how Oregon football's recruiting priorities need to be centered around the offensive and defensive line. There are some big time targets on both sides of the ball in the trenches for the class of 2023, but when could they commit and where does Oregon stand with a lot of these guys? We'll find out today. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thank you for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. I appreciate the hundreds and hundreds of you out there who have done so already to make the show what it has become, something that I'm very proud of and love doing. I also love bringing on John Garcia Jr., this slacker who took a week off on vacation. The nerve. I'm just playing, of course. John, it is great to have you back. Can't wait to talk some recruiting here.
Good to be back, Spencer. It seems like at any stage of the summer, if you take any time off, you're going to play a lot of catch up. But thankfully, that part of the work week is behind us, and we can get into some of these upcoming decisions. Absolutely.
Yeah, and John, for those of you who don't know, is the director of recruiting at Sports Illustrated and a regular here at the Locked On Podcast Network. And now the dead zone is the dead period rather in recruiting is done, and so stuff is kind of opening back up, and that's what I want to ask you about first. There was that prolonged stretch from about the end of June to just a couple of days ago where you couldn't have any guys on campus for unofficial or official visits, and stuff had really slowed down. But now that fall camps are around the corner, you can have guys on campus again. So what are timelines going to be like here, and when could commitments really start to ramp up with the season, just over a month away?
Yeah, I think it's a time where we see a lot of kids say, "Hey, I want to get this done before my senior high school football season begins." It's just a natural window for a lot of decisions to come in, and July has really been pretty busy with that just in general because June was the big official visit window for just about everybody. So now I think we're still seeing the back end of kids wanting to make decisions. So the end of July, early August, going to be another popular commitment window. But like you said, Spencer, there's another visit window in between. And a lot of schools, because high school fall camp, college fall camp, even the NFL, everyone's around the corner from really kicking this thing off. So a lot of these small visit windows this weekend in particular focused not on football, not camps, mostly barbecues, cookouts. There's a pool party at A&M. I mean, just off script kind of recruiting events just to get a little bit more face time with college coaches. So I think that could influence some decisions, but a lot of kids who are closer or already have scheduled commitments for the end of July or August 1st, like a couple, they're done. They're done with visits. They're totally in evaluation mode at this point, and they'll use the entirety of their preseason, however much is left, to lead up to that decision. But yeah, we usually see a big spike in decisions going public this time of year, and this year's no different.
Barbecues and pool parties, kind of a last hoorah before school gets back in session, so to speak. Sounds like a fun time to me. These timelines are also different on an individual level. Some guys, like you said, want to commit before their season starts. Other guys want to wait it out. Recently, a piece of news came down on the recruiting front for Oregon. Micah Banuelos, a guy who it looked like they were in a good position for, ended up going down to USC to commit for Lincoln Riley and the Trojans. And, in my view, that's a position of need for Oregon on the recruiting trail in the class of 2023. I think, young offensive linemen going forward. There are some guys on the roster, to be sure. But if you're talking about blue chip caliber prospects, it's really Josh Conerly and a lot of question marks going forward. And so one guy, we'll talk about a couple offensive linemen here. Samson Okunlola is kind of the biggest fish remaining, at least that I'm aware of, as far as the offensive line is concerned nationally in the recruiting landscape. He's a big-time five-star and has got all the tools. He's from the East Coast, and he's a guy who, looks like he might be trending towards Miami, but is Oregon still in this thing, and what's his commitment timeline?
I think that last part is really the entire key to this thing, Spencer. Miami definitely holds the most buzz today. I don't think that's really questionable at this stage. But he took a lot of visits in the summer: Oregon, Michigan State, of course, Miami, among them. And there's a sense that if he does join these other guys who want to commit before their senior seasons begin, then the Hurricanes are probably the pick. But Samson hasn't committed to that just yet. He's considering it. He understands why that window is a popular one, but he hasn't flat out come out and said, "Hey, I am going to commit before my senior season begins." And he's got official visits still to be taken. So I do think that could potentially help bump him to a little bit more of a relaxed timeline. Maybe he wants to take in some game day atmospheres, which why would you blame any recruit for wanting to do that, especially one who might be the most coveted offensive tackle in America on top of everything else. I do think that's a strong possibility with Samson. So if that becomes more of a reality, I think Oregon and Michigan State in particular probably benefit the most. The other contenders are like Bama and Georgia. I mean, they're going to be in it whether you want to commit today, tomorrow, or on signing day. But I think for programs that are a little bit more, I guess, today reliant on visits like Oregon, Michigan State's, programs that haven't quite dug into what they're going to be relative to their young coaching staffs. I do think, the longer the better in their pursuit, because they'll be able to potentially get a game day visit, and then the coaches will be able to go in home. And I think that's kind of the not talked about enough element of all these summer decisions. Is a lot of these are coming with, meetings in coaches' offices and things like that are brief, not so much as the classic coach going to your house and closing the deal during the recruiting process, like we do get to see later this year come December. So I do think that would be interesting for Okunlola should his recruitment extend to that point. So I do think that there's still a decision to be made from a timeline perspective. And if you're an Oregon fan, which if you're listening to this show, you probably are, maybe some Washington fans just kind of cross-pollinating, checking on the enemy there. You do want this thing to extend for Okunlola, and he'll be worth it. He'll be one of these recruits that can afford to commit and wait as long or as quickly as he wants, because he's that coveted from coast to coast. And yeah, Oregon doesn't have an O-line commitment, so naturally, yeah, they're going to stay in that mix as long as they possibly can.
Another potential offensive line recruit that the Ducks are looking at, who seems like somebody who could come in and maybe play a good amount as a freshman, but certainly projects as a multi-year Power Five starter, is four-star Miles McVay, who is a large human being. Uh, he's a really big dude. That's another guy the Ducks are kind of after. And so where is Oregon at? And I assume Adrian Clem is the guy who's going after him primarily on Oregon staff.
Yeah, this one has shifted a whole lot. One, McVay was kind of relaxed with the timeline, and now it looks like he's starting to push it up. Oregon is right in the thick of that conversation. I think Alabama's gotten some buzz with him as well. So I do get curious to know how firm he is on making this preseason decision. I think that could be an Oregon versus Alabama type of battle. I know other schools have been kind of in and out on him: Florida, Miami, I think Texas A&M in particular. So I'm curious to see just how sure he is on that preseason decision. But yeah, Oregon has absolutely done good work in this recruitment. They have spot recruited the St. Louis area pretty well, I would say, under multiple coaching staffs. So I do think that would be another, feather in the duck cap in that regard as well. But like you said, Spencer, a major position of need up front on the offensive line. And Bama's gotten a couple O-line commitments recently. They flipped a kid from Georgia, Rakeez McElderry, and they just got Olis Allen in, one of the top tackles in the class, to commit. So you wonder, space-wise with Alabama, how much can they afford to continue to add at the position with other targets like Okunlola and a couple others, Monroe Freeling, still out there for the Crimson Tide. So that could be a bit of a beneficial angle from the Oregon perspective if Bama stays hot on the recruiting trail, which it seems like they always are.
I want to ask you about something you just mentioned on the other side, but first to tell you about Bet Online, the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the number one source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball. Go Mariners, always. NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even my personal favorite, golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource For all your sports wagering information from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline is where the game starts. Something you mentioned in there, John, was about in-game. Actually, no, I literally just forgot what I was going to ask you. Oh, now I remember. Sorry. Mind is just absolutely in another
That's all
galaxy.
those late nights watching the Mariners, man, catching up to you.
Yeah. I think it may very well be. But the thing I wanted to ask you about was the number of players at a given position on a roster. So when you go on 24/7 and look at the schools who have offered a particular kid, then you can see how many in that position group they have on the roster. In your experience, and you've covered recruiting in college football for a long, long time, does that play into how a kid views a particular school? If he knows, like, boy, there's 8 offensive linemen on the roster at my position, is that going to factor into his decision?
Maybe it's not always kind of a 1-to-1 ratio as much as we think, and we like to play kind of the hypothetical game. If I were this kid, this is where I would look, kind of deal. But I do think it does resonate with the top of those depth charts, the best players. So if you've got a left tackle who's looking at a school that started a true freshman at left tackle last year, and he's very good, and he's projected to be maybe an All-American, something like that. Absolutely, that matters because the path to playing time appears to be a long one if you go to a school like that and you're dead set on playing left tackle in that hypothetical. So yeah, I do think the top of those depth charts absolutely matter. Programs that are overhauling the offensive line are going to have a little bit more freedom and flexibility to recruit higher end kids because you can now tangibly sell them on, hey, if you bring what we think you could bring, you got a shot to play early or start early or even contribute early, even on the 2 deep. That's something that could certainly sell on the recruiting trail. So yeah, I do think that's something that players keep an eye on in general. I will say though that offensive linemen aren't as conventional with that compared to other positions. I've heard it certainly from quarterbacks the most, running backs, wide receivers, defensive backs, even pass rushers. Not so much with the bigger guys, the offensive linemen, the interior defensive linemen. There is much more of a sense of, if I'm good enough, I'll play. If not, I need to develop and put in more work, and then I'll get there eventually. So less divas with the bigger guys in college football recruiting, but it's certainly something that still comes up and is still it could be a wild card depending on the different angles and pitches that a certain individual gets from different schools.
And nowadays, for a lot of guys, unfortunately, in my view, the mindset is not as often, if I'm not good enough, then I need to develop and get better. It's I need to transfer to a place where I can play. But a conversation perhaps for another day. Let's move to the defensive side of the ball for Oregon's 2023 recruiting, and the most well, not recent because it hasn't happened yet, but the one that will take place the soonest is Terrence Green, 4-star defensive lineman out of the state of Texas. He's committing on Monday, and Oregon, from what I've been able to discern, is in a pretty good place with him, and they have a good shot at him, and they've been there for a while. But we bring you on, John, because you're the expert. So where does Oregon stand with him?
Yeah, they stand in a really great spot. Michigan State's probably the primary competition. Brandon Jordan is kind of this pass rushing specialist who was training kids in Texas, and then he got the job at Michigan State. So they've been really busy in Texas, but so has Oregon. We've talked about this a lot on the show that Oregon has put an emphasis on the state, and they're having success going down there. And I think the positioning of the last official visit at the end of June was a really big deal with the Green recruitment because there was a sense that he was going to take other visits. USC, a couple other schools were involved looking to get a late official visit, but the Ducks getting the last one, I think, is going to have some staying power here for Green. And if your last name is Green, you should be down to Oregon and Michigan State, right? Because you're going to rock that color at the next level. But yeah, I think Tosh Lupoi, Tui Toi, the other D-line coach, I mean, those guys have collaborated and combined here for a really nice pitch from the Oregon perspective. And he's an inside-out guy too. I think there's some edge ability potentially, but he's got the frame to work inside down the line. And that's something that fits the modern scheme, something we know Dan Lanning wants up at UO. So I do think the fit here for Terrence Green makes a lot of sense for the Ducks, who do again have that momentum basically since that visit, because other trips were canceled thereafter. And that usually tells us that the school that recently got him on campus is probably in the best shape.
Well, hopefully that ends up being the case. I think he reminds me a little bit stylistically of Brandon Dorlis. I don't know how much you know about him, but he's a guy who primarily in his career with the Ducks has played on the interior of the defensive line. But we've seen him line up in that defensive end position as well. You know, if a guy is rotating out because of subs or he got some injuries, or maybe just depending on the personnel package, he can play inside out. So I think that versatility is something that Oregon fans are a little bit familiar with from a body type. And I feel like it's harder to find those sorts of guys. You know, when you look at these edge prospects, like we'll talk about a couple here in a moment, the edge prospects typically are not guys who will shift inside, except for Kayvon Thibodeau, who's very, very unique in that
Yeah,
sense, where he
I'd
could
say so.
play. Yeah, where he can play anywhere. But is that what you've kind of noticed when guys have that designation as an edge player? You know, you're hand down in a 4-3, standing up in a 3-4. You know, Kayvon Thibodeau, Dion Jordan type of player for the Ducks. That typically those guys are not going to shift inside, and it's more likely that someone who's listed as defensive lineman would perhaps be able to go inside or out.
For sure. You know, these guys want to be pass rushers, and that is the first spot your brain goes to when you think of a great pass rusher. It's on the edge, working an offensive tackle with a clear path to the quarterback. They don't want to be inside dealing with the bigger, wider guys in the wash and the muck, as they call it. Yeah, they want to be one on one with a tackle where they've got a pretty clear path to making that big play, that sack that really changes the drives and changes games in a lot of instances. So yeah, if you're an edge guy, you want to stay there. And there's a lot of bigger guys, 280 pounders that are like, I'm an edge too. You know, everybody wants to be that defensive end that gets the glory off of the edge. But yeah, obviously not for everybody, but these guys that are known for it certainly want to stick there. And if you ask, I think every defensive lineman, they would say they prefer to play outside, and then work their way inside. It's rarely the opposite.
The other thing too, you mentioned the glory on the defensive line. It comes with sacks, right? Or sacks or TFLs, and I think defensive tackles have a better chance to rack up the TFLs comparatively to the guys who are playing on the outside. But I think there are a number of instances where a defensive end gets credit for a sack because he makes the sack, but the quarterback is actually forced into him by the pressure from the interior defensive lineman. That's the sort of stuff that doesn't show up on a box score. It shows up in, say, like PFF grading, right? Or those sorts of evaluations of guys and how they play. But if you want to make it to the league, if you want to be somebody that stands out, stats are a great way to do it. And I think that makes a lot of sense what you're saying about guys wanting to be outside first. Speaking of edge prospects, Oregon is understandably after a couple of high-level guys at that position as well. Samuel Mpemba is a name that's been tossed around, and then there's a couple other defensive linemen I want to ask you about. I think we'll close with Mateo Uiagalelei here, but Mpemba kind of a month ago or so felt like someone that Oregon had offered and wasn't super interested. I mean, they were interested, but there wasn't a ton of momentum there. To me, it still feels like the Ducks are on the outside of his recruitment, but correct me if I'm wrong, they're closer to him than they were 6 weeks ago.
100%, and I think he's taken this thing the opposite compared to a lot of the guys we've talked about. He's going to take his time. There's really no buzz about Mpemba coming off the board early. He hasn't even taken an official visit just yet. So yeah, he's truly earlier in the recruiting process. Another St. Louis native we talked about with McVey, something that Oregon has begun to push a little bit more for. And Siri agrees with me there that Oregon's making some good headway down there or up there. But yeah, Mpemba, totally early in the process. He's taken a few visits recently. Florida, I think Tennessee has gotten him on campus, Notre Dame as well. But yeah, this is a long-standing recruitment. He's got a top 7. Oregon's in there. But yeah, I think once he starts to set official visits, then we're going to get a lot clearer a picture of the programs that are going to continue to contend for Mpemba, who is now fully committed to playing edge. I think that was one of the things early in his recruitment that had him maybe off course a little bit. But Georgia coveted him very early on. Dan Lanning was a part of that as an edge prospect, and that's something that he's going to continue to reciprocate in coveting the Bulldogs as well as Oregon with Lanning leading that charge. So Mpemba, another national recruit, another long-standing battle that Oregon has to stay in the mix for. But again, no officials to date, very few visits planned during the season. So you would imagine Mpemba takes at least one trip out to Oregon. And once that happens, you're in the ballgame, maybe for good with a recruit like that who's in no rush. So yeah, I think Oregon and Mpemba is definitely a twosome you got to keep an eye on as time goes on here and this next wave of commitments gets behind us.
Another name we've followed for a while here on the defensive line when talking about recruiting is the top defensive lineman in the class of 2023, and he has not committed yet, David Hicks, and he is a big-time player in every way. I mean, there's not a lot to miss here. Very, very high floor and probably a high ceiling guy as well, the sort of player who comes in to your football program and makes an impact right away as a true freshman, a little bit like Kayvon Thibodeau did. Where is he at? Because I know he's also had a little bit longer of a recruiting process, and is Oregon still seemingly in the mix for him?
Yeah, well, Duck's still right in it. He's like Mpemba from a timeline perspective, but unlike Mpemba, he's taken some officials, and that Oregon trip resonated with him. I think he's returned back up to Oregon at least once again this offseason. So yeah, the Ducks are doing pretty good work in the Hicks department. We've talked about them making waves in Texas. That would certainly be the biggest one that maybe Oregon has ever made in that state, but certainly one that would keep an eye on from a recruiting perspective. Yeah, because Hicks is nowhere close to a decision, and some similar schools in the mix: Michigan State, Miami, Texas A&M, Texas. I mean, some of the same schools we've been talking about for a lot of these prospects, which is kind of interesting to me because there's not a lot of brand new coaching staffs on those lists for these big time 5-star All-American type of recruits. But Oregon has stayed at the forefront of that despite the turnover at the coaching staff. So I do think that's interesting and impressive from a recruiting standpoint, especially with a kid from Texas, where, outside of the traditional footprint, you wouldn't automatically associate Oregon with a kid like that. But here they are, multiple visits already in, more maybe on the way during the season itself. So I think, yeah, David Hicks, absolutely another one to keep an eye on. Just like Uiagalelei, just like Mpemba, no rush for them to make commitments. So even if you grab one of the three, you've hit, a big time mark from a recruiting standpoint with a top out-of-state target, which is just not easy to do.
I certainly would love to see Oregon get Terrence Green's commitment on Monday. That'd be the first defensive lineman who's committed in the Dan Lanning, Tosh Lupoi era, or at least a more notable one. Tavito Pamee is a big body from the state of Utah, 3-star guy, but Green would be, I think, from a prospect level, a little bit above that. But to me, those big 3 5-star edge players, or I guess Hicks is not, those big 5-star defensive linemen, Hicks and Mpemba, and the guy I want to ask you about here, Mateo Uiagalelei. I would really like to see Oregon get one of them. You're not going to get multiple, of course. That's just not. I mean, that would be that's not going to happen. But getting one of them is certainly feasible. And you come in as a defensive staff with the recruiting history that Lanning and Lupoi have in their pasts, and I think these are the sorts of players that Duck fans need to be expecting are able to commit. So Mateo's the one who I've had my eye on for the longest time in terms of Oregon having the best chance potentially because he's from the state of California, but he's also looking at USC. So his timeline, as you said, a little bit more drawn out, but Oregon, from what I've been able to discern, still squarely in the mix.
Yeah, he's got a top group, but I think you could probably construct a top 3 within Uyangalele's recruitment, and I think Oregon would be in it. I think USC would be in it. I think Ohio State could kind of be that third program, maybe a dark horse for Mateo at this point. Clemson buzz has seemed to be so ebb and flow relative to his big brother, relative to kind of the up and downness of his own career at Clemson. And Clemson's also loaded up on the D line. So you wonder, not that you're going to say no to Mateo, but you do wonder how important that becomes for Clemson going forward. They've got like 6 or 7 D linemen committed, it seems like, and there's a couple more that could be on the way here soon. So some of that ACC, SEC buzz has faded a little bit for Mateo. So naturally, Ohio State, USC, and Oregon, I think, are in the best shape today. But that's the thing. This recruitment's going all the way. The family's got means to travel. They're going to be at games. So I would certainly watch that to see, where the buzz maybe shifts again. But as of the late summer months, yeah, I think he's Pac-12 bound with Ohio State, and the Big Ten is a bit of a dark horse there. Or I guess the Big Ten is now including USC as we get further into that conversation. But traditionally speaking, I do think the West Coast schools feel really good about Mateo, and they should at this point, but still a long way to go there. So, yeah, same timeline for Mateo and Pemba and Hicks, and I think that's makes it quite interesting for Oregon relative to who they could stay in the hunt for or prioritize closer to signing day.
Lots of names to follow on the recruiting trail, and no better guy to discuss them with than John Garcia Jr., the director of recruiting at Sports Illustrated. Good to have you back, and good to have you on today.
Always a pleasure, Spencer. Thanks for having me back on.
I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.